My name is Jordan Ecker. I'm a senior, obviously. Excited to graduate in a couple days. And my SYP is on Infinite Jest. My SYP really began about a year ago when I started reading Infinite Jest for the first time. I'm a pretty quick reader, but Infinite Jest took me about 4 months to read, most of the season. And I think that was just about the longest I've ever spent on a book reading it since I've been in middle school maybe. So my topic was Infinite Jest. The question I was looking at is, what is Infinite Jest saying? What message should I take away from this? And my thesis is pretty nuanced, and hopefully we'll get there by the end of the presentation. So Infinite Jest was released in 1996. It's considered to be David Foster Wallace's magnum opus. Upon its release, it was seen by many critics as taking the next step in fiction and moving beyond the former limits of American literature, which at that time were really postmodernism and minimalism. It's different from postmodernism in that it attempts to actively solve the problems it describes rather than just satirizing them, and it's different from minimalism, and it's like an 1,100-page book, very overwrought, lots of descriptions. I didn't make any of these charts, just a disclaimer. So it's a complicated, long book. You can kind of see from up there how the plot rotates around a lot of things. It's got tons of major and minor characters. Each one of these dots represents a character, and each line represents a relationship between characters. And my paper is really character-driven instead of plot-driven, and we'll kind of talk about that in the next slide. So this is a chart of the plot of Infinite Jest. The plot is kind of like bizarre in like the typical postmodern, Pynchon fashion. It's focused around Quebecois terrorists who are attempting to dismantle the Organization of North American Nations. The United States in this future has annexed both Mexico and Canada, and these Quebecois terrorists are trying to bring it down by disseminating a movie so addictive when the viewer sees it, they literally give up all other pursuits in life and starve to death. But my paper, like I said before, focused on two of the main protagonists. One, Howland Condenza, is a 17-year-old boy who goes to Enid Tennis Academy. The other is Don Gately, a recovering addict who lives in the Enid Sobriety House. So I'll start by talking about Howland Condenza. So for most of the book, chronologically speaking, and in terms of paper, Howland Condenza is described as a lexical prodigy. He's memorized the Oxford English Dictionary. He's the second best tennis player in his highly prestigious tennis prep school, and he's the sixth best on the continent. He's expected to get a 2400 on his SAT. Things are going really well for Hal. His external life seems to be, almost approaching perfect. But internally, Hal is kind of a mess. He's addicted to marijuana and smokes it every day. And his dad, towards the end of his dad's life, his dad commits suicide. His dad hallucinates that he's not even speaking. These are a couple quotes that come about 2/3 of the way through the text. Hal himself had a bona fide intensity of interior life type emotion since he was tiny. He finds terms like joy and value to be like so many variables in rarefied equations. Inside Hal, there's pretty much nothing at all he knows. And his dad is worried that he's experiencing death in life, solipsism, or anhedonia. So what Hal really feels is that he's like a perfect human being externally, but internally there's nothing at all. Like he feels like he's rotten, a motif that Wallace kind of borrows from Hamlet, and there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. That internally something is wrong, while externally everything appears to be fine. And by the end of the book, chronologically, although it's the first chapter in terms of the narrative, Hal has become someone who has trouble communicating. So he's gone from this lexical prodigy who has mastered the English language and is able to manipulate language to appear as though he has emotions and appears as though he is like a full, authentic human being, to someone who is inside. He observes many times throughout the first chapter that I'm in here, but cannot communicate at all. When he tries to talk, the people who he's speaking to thinks he's having a seizure and have no idea what he's saying. And so even though he has such authentic thoughts, or genuine and intimate thoughts, like I do things like get in a taxi and say the library and step on it, the people he's trying to say this to, some admissions officers at the University of Arizona, hear sub-animalistic noises. So again, he observed that he's not a creatus manufactured condition bred for a function. He's not a machine. But now that he's not a machine, he can't even communicate that. And so Hal has some serious problems. If Hal's plotline was the only plotline within Infinite Jest, it would really be a tragedy about the failure of perfectionism and the emptiness of modern American life. But Wallace offers us another protagonist in Don Gately. Don Gately's journey both mirrors and foils Hal's. So while Hal is good at tennis because he plays it like chess, Don Gately is good at football because he had a really big head and slammed it into his opponents. He struggled with substance abuse like Hal all his life, although he's now a recovering addict and recovering alcoholic, and he attends Alcoholics Anonymous meetings daily. And for him, communication, while his language isn't always technically correct and his vocabulary is pretty limited, it's still about sharing common experiences, and I'll get back to that in a minute when we examine some of the philosophical underpinnings of Infinite Jest. But I want to observe two of the major differences, or one of the major differences between Don Gately and Hal, and that's Don Gately's willingness to have faith, and willingness to have faith that he can have faith. So Gately, towards the end of the book, in the 800s, it's an 1100-page book, Gately is visited by a wraith, a ghost of Hal's father. And Gately is willing to believe in this wraith. Gately begins to conclude it's not impossible that the garden variety of wraith, though not conventionally real, could be sort of an epiphany-ish vision from Gately's personally confused higher power. So Gately's willingness to accept this ghost's reality, or at least pretend it's real, so he can, learn something about himself from it, and how it bears on his alcoholism and problem with addictions. Higher power is a line from Alcoholics Anonymous vocabulary. Allows him to get better, and I'll demonstrate how that's really true later. But Hal and Condensa's problem with Hamlet, for example, wasn't that Hamlet spent the majority of the plot of the play worrying, but that Hamlet didn't question it enough. That Hamlet believed in the ghost when Hal thought Hamlet should have questioned the reality of the ghost. So for Hal, Hamlet isn't paralyzed enough. Gately's other big difference, again, is his willingness to act as though he has faith in God, regardless of whether he does. It didn't matter at this point what he thought or believed or even said. All that mattered was what he did. If he did the right things and kept doing them for long enough, what Gately thought and believed would magically change. If Gately acts like he has faith, Gately believes he eventually will have faith and will be able to overcome his alcoholism. So those are the two protagonists within Infinite Jest, and the way I looked at them in my paper and in my thesis was through the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein. And I'm going to examine the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein using a Kanye West quote, which is, what does Webster say about Saul? Talking about Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And so really what Wittgenstein, I think, tells us about Infinite Jest is why Don Gately is in a better frame of mind than Hal and Condensa. Hal and Condensa and Don Gately mirror the two stages of Wittgenstein's philosophy of language. So what's interesting about Wittgenstein is that there's two distinct stages that he goes through in terms of philosophy of language. There's the early Ludwig Wittgenstein and the late Ludwig Wittgenstein, and they directly contradict each other. They're untenable when held together. And so the early Ludwig Wittgenstein is best encapsulated by the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And this is the type of philosophy of language that Hal and Hal's mom would really believe in. And it's this belief that language is a logically perfectible and noble science that we can perfect, right? So for this early Wittgenstein, languages made up of propositions. These propositions are either agree or disagree with reality. If they cannot be tested against reality, then these propositions are nonsense. So a picture agrees with reality or fails to agree. It is correct or incorrect, true or false. For this early Wittgenstein, this solves philosophical problems because he believes they only arise when we make propositions that cannot be tested against reality. This philosophical thought led to the founding of the positivist circle, the Vienna Circle, in the 1930s and 1940s, and dominated philosophical thought for most of the beginning of the 20th century. So because of this kind of led to a solipsistic understanding of both being and language. The limits of my language are the limits of my world. Your world is totally contained within yourself and your understanding of it, right? If you cannot express something about the world within your own language, it might as well not exist. And so where one cannot speak, there one must be silent. So things that can't be tested against reality, like you should do this or that is the right thing to do, are nonsense, and they shouldn't be said at all. So the problem isn't that isn't some nihilistic problem, but rather that we're all speaking nonsense when we make moral claims about reality, when we make metaphysical claims about reality, etc. And so Hal really believes in this kind of language. His language is totally correct. He believes the rules of language are tacit and can be learned and can be mastered, as demonstrated through his memorization of the Oxford English Dictionary and his essentially fetish for using correct syntax and grammar. This is a house built by early Wittgenstein in the 1920s and 30s. I just took a picture of it because I think it demonstrates quite nicely his philosophy, really, because it's like really plain squares, simple geometry, not much flair at all. And all of this lack of flair and lack of appreciation for human community and really art comes entirely undone in late Wittgenstein. So late Ludwig Wittgenstein is best encapsulated by a book published post-mortem, Philosophical Investigations, which was published in 1953, and is a compilement of all his lectures at the University of Cambridge during the 1930s and 40s. And so what happened to make Wittgenstein change all his ideas and overturn his philosophy is he was walking down the streets of Cambridge one day, and someone walked up and flipped him off. And this angered him quite a bit, and he understood that there's something being communicated here, right? Because he was being angered by something someone else was doing, but that middle finger didn't seem to compare itself to reality. It didn't seem to have a logical structure. It didn't seem to be a proposition at all, but there was still something being communicated. So this caused Wittgenstein and his anger to go back to his home and rewrite all of his philosophy. And this is what he came up with. He decided that language is an implicit game played by human communities. So it's no longer a logically knowable system made up of tacit rules that we can come to know and understand and master, but it's instead an implicit game that we all agree to play with each other, and that we all do play. So for example, when I say the color blue, you all think of blue. When we're young kids sometimes, or I had these thoughts that, ooh, what if when other people say blue, what they think of blue is actually red to me? That doesn't happen because we've all participated in the same language game where blue represents what we all think of as blue, like your shirt, for example. So essentially. So even though my words aren't defined by their reference, they're defined by the usage we've all come to be known to be used in. So this blue doesn't necessarily represent that shade of blue. It can also be either of these shades of blue. But we all still understand it as blue. And that's because of the context that we've been using them in. And so that kind of leads him to this quote, if a lion could speak, we would not understand him. So even if a lion had mastery over the English language or had the ability to speak, it wouldn't be able to talk to us because its context of experiences and its past usages simply are so far set apart from ours that we have no common ground on which to discuss things with. So Don Gately and Alcoholics Anonymous, even in the real world, are big fans of this philosophy of language. Because for Alcoholics Anonymous, language is a tool to be used to share experiences with alcoholism, right? So when you go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, especially within Infinite Jest, it's all about speakers standing up and giving their stories about their experiences with alcohol and how that alcohol abuse has damaged them. So language is about sharing ideas with the human community and especially sharing past shared experiences that people can empathize with. Late Wittgenstein also believed that philosophy was meant to be therapeutic. He has a famous quote, "Lead the fly out of the fly bottle." So reading philosophical investigations is written kind of playfully with lots of rhetorical questions and conversationally to lead the reader along into the book. So Wittgenstein's goal was that this would read therapeutically, and instead of not necessarily logically solving all your philosophical problems, but maybe making you feel as though you can live with those contradictions because of a number of technical things. So this is the main problem I found in Infinite Jest, and this is a David Foster Wallace quote that he gave in a review of John Updike's fiction. Today's sub-40s have different horrors, prominent among them which are enemy and solipsism and a peculiarly American loneliness, the prospect of dying without once having loved something more than yourself. So this is really Hal's problem, right? He's become so obsessed with his own perfectionism that he's given up the human community. And this is evidenced by his inability to speak at the chronological end of the book. Hal is unable to speak at the end of the book because he has exited a human community like the lion, right? So his inability to speak comes from him not having any shared experiences with other human beings because he's become so obsessed with his own internal world. So The message David Foster Wallace is sending us is that when we become so obsessed with our perfectionism and our need for others to view us as perfect, we try to distance ourselves from others. Because if you know who I truly am inside, you may be able to legitimately pass judgment upon me. And this terrifies us. This terrified Hal. If he doesn't get a 2400 on his SAT, he's a massive disappointment to every, I think he calls them, major role model figure around him. And so in order to not let other people pass these legitimate judgments on us, we try and distance ourselves using things like irony. Irony was the common tool of the postmodernists who sought to satirize the system and distance themselves away from it by making ironic jokes about it. But for Wallace, if all we are people who make ironic jokes about things, we end up distancing ourselves from them, distancing ourselves from the human community, and we actually become ironic. This also follows in late Wittgenstein's philosophy, where he talks about rule following. So if I'm just doing an impression of a confident person right now, instead of actually being a confident person, there's no difference. I end up being the same person either way because my actions only follow what my impression is, what my impression of what I am is doing. So because we can't tell that there's no difference between someone who's doing an impression of an ironic person or someone who's actually deep down a real authentic person who's just being ironic to make a joke, and a person who just is really ironic all the time, and that's like their heart, like they just satirize things. When we feel like we are authentic people making ironic jokes, we actually end up becoming ironic people who don't have much of an inner life at all, and that's what happens to Hal. He becomes rotten because he tries to distance himself so far away from human community with irony and jokes, etc., that he ends up becoming an empty person. So this is a uniquely terrifying experience, and it's something that Wallace wants to help us overcome with Infinite Jest, and there's a couple ways he does this. So my paper was titled, I Am in Here, Infinite Jest and the Power of Literature. And I think Infinite Jest itself, both within the narrative and the narrative in real life, serves to help us not be so ironic in our doings, be more genuine, be more intimate, and be a part of the human community, and does this in a few ways. Within the book, Hal's father, James Ornan Condenza, makes the addictive movie that's so entertaining that people can't stop watching it because he wants to draw Hal outside of himself. He wants to make a movie so powerful and so enthralling that Hal feels compelled to discuss it with other human beings. It's unclear whether Hal actually watches the movie. That's left ambiguous by the end of the narrative. But if Hal did, it clearly hasn't worked, because if anything, he's only become more insular by the chronological end of the book. But I think Wallace is really forwarding the thesis that books can do this even if Hal's father's entertainment failed. And that's because books are paradoxically both selfish and selfless. Infinite Jest is only understood with an actively participating reader. This is because of a notion called parallax that was developed and used by James Joyce as a motif in Ulysses. And really what this means is that within the text of Ulysses, within that narrative, it's only understood within the reader's head, right? Because you have three principal figures, the Telemachid, James Bloom, and Molly Bloom. And each have their own little plot lines that diverge and then converge. But this big divergence and convergence doesn't happen, like the three characters aren't aware it's happening. Only the reader is aware it's happening, and only the reader can connect the dots between them. And so James Joyce makes lots of motifs to parallax, like he makes motifs to everything in that book. And the point is that the author isn't the one who possesses the meaning. The text isn't the one who possesses the intrinsic meaning. It's in the reader's head. And this is true in Infinite Jest too, because the book takes place in two time periods. It takes place in November of the year of the adult undergarment, the years have become subsidized, and November of the year of Glad. And you don't see what happens in between those 2 years. You only see the results, which is Hal is completely unable to talk to people. He's transformed dramatically. So the plot itself needs to be found within the reader. The reader needs to be able to connect the lines connect the missing dots, and make the narrative arc whole within their own mind. So it's almost a selfish practice in that point, right? As the reader, I hold the meaning of the text. But it's also a selfless practice, because David Foster Wallace challenges the reader to go in between different language games constantly and slip through different characters' skins persistently throughout the text. So 1 minute we are in Ennet Tennis Academy, and within Ennet Tennis Academy, David Foster Wallace is very careful to keep all his grammar and syntax precise, keep his vocabulary very large, and use no slang whatsoever. But as soon as we leave the Ennet Tennis Academy and go to, say, Don Gately's Alcoholics Sobriety House or an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, all of that goes to hell. The grammar and syntax becomes much worse, and there's slang everywhere, and the meaning of words can change depending on their context at like the drop of a hat. So the reader is demanded to not impose their self upon this, not impose a single grammar upon the novel. They have to adopt grammars as they turn the pages. And what we do when we experience both these things, when we experience the death of the author and allow ourselves to contain the meaning of the novel, while at the same time going from language game to language game, is we become grounded in the present. And this is what Don Gately concludes at the end of the novel in terms of its narrative, and why it's really a redemptive novel. Don Gately says, "No one single second of it was unendurable. Here was a second right here. He endured it. What was unendurable with was the thought of all the instants all lined up and stretching ahead, glittering." So our problem isn't that we think too little. It's that we think too much. It's that when I start reading Infinite Jest, I view it as an 1,100-page book. If I do that, Infinite Jest becomes unreadable, right? If I read 300 pages of Infinite Jest and think to myself, "Gosh, I have 800 more to go," it becomes unreadable. You have to read Infinite Jest page by page, word by word, because if you don't, and you start lining them all up and you think, Jesus, there's probably hundreds of thousands of words in here, you will give up in despair. And that's what Don Gately realizes. Don Gately realizes that people like Hal, who are intent upon planning and perfecting their lives, think about all the moments lined up ahead of them and think about life as this terrible journey that they have to complete, and see the goal as like hundreds of yards away, and they despair. And so for Don Gately, that's the wrong way to live. We have to ground ourselves in the present. We have to be both selfish and selfless. We have to value ourselves, but we also have to value the human community we're a part of. And if we do this, two cool quotes, one from Wittgenstein, we understand that death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. If we take eternity to mean not infinite temporal duration, but timelessness, then eternal life belongs to he who lives in the present. So essentially what Wittgenstein is saying here is that immortality is possible because there's an infinite amount of time between even the two closest points. That's a David Foster Wallace quote. So if we actually truly ground ourselves in this present, we'll find that there's infinities everywhere. And that's echoed by Hamlet in this quote, "I could be bounded up in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I had bad dreams." The bad dreams in Infinite Jest are our need for perfection, our desperation that other people think we're perfect, and our scare and our horror and our terror that they will think we're not. If we get away from these bad dreams, then we can ground ourselves in the present. And one way we can do this is by reading and being empathetic, while also at the same time being selfish. And if we do all this, then we can get away from the anxiety of life. We can get away from our desperate need for perfectionism. We can break ourselves out of the rat race, and we can become more authentic human beings. And that's my SYP. Thanks for coming.
So there were a number of connections and references that you made, and thank you for sharing. I'm sorry. The first question I got to ask is a very simple one.
Sure.
Some of the connections you made at the beginning, those slides, did you actually design those?
No, I tried to say that. So like the.
Yeah. No, that's okay.
These guys are from the internet. I'm not a visual learner.
No, that's good.
Okay.
But you made similar connections for us here today. And so the question I want to ask is, what were the connections that for you really meant something and took you to another place?
Okay. So there's a character in here called Madame Psychosis. And in Ulysses, there's like this concept that's always repeated called the metempsychosis. I don't really know what that means because I don't understand Ulysses that well. But when I realized that, that's really cool, right? Like the fact that he's alluding so directly but so subtly that it escaped me for a long time. The Hamlet stuff is really, really neat, and I didn't do everything I could have with it. There's definitely more places it's going. At one point, a group of young tennis academy students are like wandering through like the basement of the tennis academy, and they found like this fridge which has like a lot of rotten food in it, which is a pretty direct allusion to something that's rotten in the state of Denmark. There's in terms of just the plot narrative, there's a lot going on with Hamlet. So Hal's dad kills himself, and it's kind of unclear whether his mom like pressured his dad into killing himself or not, and then Hal's half uncle moves into his house and is sleeping with his mom. Hal is paralyzed by anxiety for parts of the novel. So there's pretty direct allusions there. There's some stuff going on with the brothers Karamazov. It's a tale of three brothers and the dad who kills himself. Hal has two brothers. Don Gately, in a lot of ways, people think his 9 steps of recovery mirror the 9 challenges of Hercules. I didn't look at that at all, but that's kind of cool too. The coolest illusion, though, is Hamlet begins with the words, "Who's there?" The first 2 words of Infinite Jest are "I am." So, yeah, those are the coolest illusions, I think.
Could I take a moment and ask why one or more of those connections was important to you?
So I think the Hamlet ones are really the coolest to me because I empathize with both the character of Hamlet and the character of Hal. A lot of people, when they read Hamlet, they come away thinking kind of like a Holden Caulfield impression, like, oh, he's a whiny, like, needs to grow up and just like kill the guy. But for me, I empathize a lot with that like kind of paralyzing anxiety, like overanalyzing things. So the illusions made there, I think, kind of connected the 2 texts for me and made me see Hal as like a 21st century. I mean, his name's Hal. Like that's a pretty clear play on Hamlet. It's like a 21st century Hamlet. Yeah.
How about David Foster Wallace himself? How much of himself did he write into Hal or Don, and is one more than the other?
So I'm pretty hesitant to try and psychoanalyze Wallace and impose that on the text. But there are pretty clear connections, right? Wallace struggled with alcoholism and drug abuse for a fair amount of his life and then got sober with Alcoholics Anonymous. He went to a sobriety house, and he went to a sobriety house down in Brighton, actually. And the book is set right here in a fictional town called Ennet, which is somewhere between Brighton and Alston, if you just look at like the real geographical references that are made. Wallace also played tennis when he was a kid pretty competitively. So I think he probably sees bits of himself in Hal, but he really wants to be Don Gately. He really wants to get away from this overanalyzation that I think probably makes him such a good writer. And he really wants to be genuine and authentic. So I think that's all there. I'm not sure if he exactly is encapsulated within a character, but probably some mix of Don Gately and Hal. And when he committed suicide, probably a lot more Hal. Yeah.
So clearly SYP is about becoming and embodying the role of a scholar. And what could be better to be a scholar than to literally take on something that requires infinite scholarship just to try to wrap your head around one piece. So I guess my questions are, 1, what drove you to pick up Infinite Jest in the first place? Like, was it by word of mouth? Did you just see it somewhere and say, I'm going to try that? Now that you've finished Infinite Jest, is this the kind of thing where you open it up again and start over and try to like go deeper? And then what comes after this? Like, is this like the start of a career path for you in taking almost unreadable books and trying to make sense of them?
So I have a habit of every summer trying to challenge myself with books. I really liked reading quite a lot in middle school, and I read like a ton. But most of what I read was, like kind of easy sci-fi, fantasy, that kind of crap. And so by the time I was like a freshman, I started wanting to challenge myself a little bit more. Freshman summer, I read, Great Gatsby and Orwell and stuff. Sophomore summer, I tackled Ulysses, which was painful. And then, so the next year I wanted a harder book. And that sophomore summer, someone had been giving me a lot of Wallace articles to read and stuff, a lot of his nonfiction. So I decided I'd do Infinite Jest, which seemed more difficult than Ulysses, at least to me. And so that's how I came across it. I wanted a bigger challenge for myself, a taller hurdle. And what comes next? This summer, I think I'm going to try and read most of the Russians. So like War and Peace and Brothers Karamazov and Notes from the Underground, I think, are the 3 I'm going to try and read. And as far as a career path, it's pretty suicidal to like get a doctorate these days. The job market sucks. I'd really, really, really love to get a doctorate in philosophy or something, but the job market is terrible. So in all likelihood, by the end of 4 years of college, I'll probably go to law school. But we'll see what happens.
What would John say about that? Sorry.
Yeah.
Just a follow-up question. First, I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks.
So many interesting connections. But I wanted to follow up on Mr. Finnegan's question. You said, so I decided that I would do Infinite Jest. I'm just wondering, as a young scholar, how did you do this? What is your approach to reading a book like this?
So my approach to Ulysses was read all of James Joyce's other books besides Finnegan's Wake first. Read some T.S. Eliot, some people in the same era, and then just jump into it and make myself read it. So when I was reading it, I remember I had like this Daft Punk album, and it was an hour long. And so I figured, okay, if I listen to the album through and read, then I read about 3% on my Kindle. So every day, a couple times a day, I'd force myself to go out, listen to the album through, read as much as I could, and then just shut down, like not think about Ulysses in the interim. So that's how I read Ulysses, how I read Infinite Jest. I read all of Wallace's nonfiction before, all of his short stories, not his other 2 novels. And then I forced myself to read it. Infinite Jest took a while longer than Ulysses. Ulysses took like 2-3 weeks for me. That kind of like hurt my self-pace. Infinite Jest took 4 months, in part because I was like still trying to grapple with junior year during the first bit, but in part because it's draining sometimes to like go from like Hal and Cadenza and his like perfect prose to like some random dude who might as well be like a flow of consciousness from like Faulkner or Joyce. So yeah, I think that answered your question somewhere in there.
Absolutely, thank you. Jordan, what are you doing next year?
I'm going to Oberlin. I'm going to major in some mixture of philosophy, English, and political science. Yeah, probably join the debate team there too. I was on the debate team here.
Any reflections on how doing senior year project affected you as a person or as a student?
Reading Infinite Jest definitely impacted my life. I used to play video games a fair amount. I don't at all anymore. They kind of seem like the instant reward type thing that marijuana resembles in the book, so that seemed like something Wallace was against. And it wasn't like I was like being preached to and then just kind of obeying. It was like reading Infinite Jest had like an actual impact on my life in that sense. But doing SYP itself, when I got this question at the informal, I said nothing, and I was just like, this doesn't have any impact on like what I'm going to do in the future. It was fun to do. But my mom said when she saw that answer on the Q&A YouTube video or whatever, she got a little mad at me for saying that and said, no, Jordan, like you learned you're going to enjoy college, you're going to enjoy doing projects like this, you're going to enjoy reading throughout the rest of your life. So I think that's what I did take away from it, is that I understood that working hard on something like this really has intrinsic rewards. For all the benefits of SYP, I really didn't need them to do this project. I was kind of doing it myself before, and then this was a great excuse to get even more in depth and give more of my time to it. So I think it really taught me that there's intrinsic value in my life to doing reading, and that I'll be a lifelong reader. Yeah.
If you had to talk to next year's seniors about the benefits of doing the senior year project, how would you sell it?
So I think there's both pros and cons, and I think the cons need to be talked about a little bit more in the ramp up to SYP, because I think what a lot of my friends did is they saw it as an excuse to get out of classes, and that the project became an excuse. So they took an easy topic, or something that they thought would be easy, but not necessarily something they were passionate about, and assumed that, okay, I'll drop all my classes, and regardless of whether I like the topic, it's easy enough that I'll be able to do it. And what it turns out is SYP actually requires you to do enough work that regardless of how easy you think your topic is, you end up spending like many hours with it. So what my advice would be, don't worry about the easiness or difficulty of your project. Worry about how passionate you are about it, because if you're passionate about it, it really doesn't feel like work, and it's much easier to motivate yourself, which is like the key to doing SYP well, I think, is having motivation. And if you have something you're passionate about, definitely go for it, because it's an opportunity to design your own curriculum and stuff, and that's nice. More freedom is always good. Yeah. Yeah.
Just wondering, did you have any idea about the themes that you would end up pulling out of this before you started it?
No, and my ideas changed a lot. At one point, I was only going to ever use earlier Wittgenstein to analyze it, and I was going to draw some conclusions like that, but that didn't really end up working. At another point, I was going to go like full out with Hamlet. I was going to read Hamlet along with it and try and like see what the illusions were doing. That didn't end up going far enough for me. And even after I'd read it the first time, I reread it. I didn't reread it all the way through for my SYP, but I reread like big portions of it, enough so I can say I think I've read it 3 times by now. My ideas kept changing, and this is where they are now. But like probably when I wake up tomorrow, I'll have some other like, oh, that's what that illusion means, and slightly retool them. But I think I got to a pretty good place. And when I started reading kind of like the scholarly literature around Infinite Jest, which I didn't really discuss in my presentation, but I discussed a little bit more in my paper. I saw people who like said ideas I was having, like the idea about Hal being an assemblage of early Wittgenstein and Don Gately being late. I saw that idea echoed a couple times, so I was like, okay, cool. Like, I'm not just like a crazy boy like living in my own world. Like, there's actually something to this. So I kind of ran with that.
Did they also highlight sort of what you said, which is the being more authentic and less perfectionistic?
I think I did it in a different way, partly because I think my reading of late Wittgenstein is a little bit less skeptical than most people read him. A lot of people read like the rule following thing about as like a demonstration of how like you can never really have a tacit rule and like you can never really say a thing definitely is another thing. I kind of just read it as saying like, no, like your internal world is always secondary to your external. And if you behave a certain way, then that behavior becomes your thoughts, etc. Stuff like that is what I read into that. So that allowed me to, I think, be a little bit more positive with my reading of Infinite Jest. It's easy to be a little bit more skeptical and negative, but I tried to keep it positive.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.